Welcome once more to the Chintan Chats. And today we have with us Dr. Ghazala Shahabuddin. If you haven't already heard her speaking on YouTube, if you haven't already read some of the work that she's edited as well as written, here's a little introduction. Dr. Shahabuddin she's a scientist, she's an ecologist who actually began her work by looking at what happens to species when ecosystems are fragmented, as happens on islands. And since then, she's really been studying what happens when land use change happens. What happens, in fact, when there's interventions and shifts in a particular ecosystem. She also works in forest ecology and wildlife policy. And she works in two particular and very different zones. One of them are the Himalayas and the other are the Aravallis. Dr. Shahabuddin also teaches at Ashoka University. Welcome, Ghazala, if I may.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
And let's just start right in because we have so many things to ask you. And I really want to, use the opportunity that we have and the time that you've so kindly given to us. I really want to talk to you about extinction. And because with all the kinds of information you have and your perspective, I really want to ask you, is extinction a reality in India? Because we know that Elizabeth Colbert has written about the sixth extinction.
Mm-hmm.
We know State of Birds in India is saying that some birds are surprisingly lower, the Indian ruler being one. But then there are some birds that are growing in number. So is extinction a reality in our country? What do you think?
I think that it is a problem to be cognizant of. And we must remember that, most people think of extinctions as a very sudden and abrupt sort of a shift, the loss of a species with all its gene pool and everything, right? But what we must remember is that extinction happens very slowly and gradually over time. It's an incremental process which is hastened by a bunch of factors that we're all, aware about. So, in fact, the kind of analysis that has happened recently, say if you take the State of India's Birds report, which last came out in 2023, that has reported that almost 38% of species have been showing either a very gradual or a rapid decline over the last 40 to 50 years. These are long-term changes. So what I want to say is that we might have very few species that have actually gone extinct from India, and we should be proud of that. It's only been the mountain quail and the pink-headed duck if we talk about birds. And of course, in terms of mammals, we have just the cheetah that went extinct and which is now being brought back. But actually, there are a range of species and quite a significant percentage, 38% to be exact, that are actually showing a decline. And also, there is a threshold over which, nothing can save species. So, and it is obviously affecting a lot of species, birds only being an indicator. So I think it's a very widespread process that is being hastened by various factors. So it is definitely something to be very concerned about.
I want to move to another passion of yours because I know you've been talking and writing and deep thinking about oaks and oak forests. And one of the things that you talk about is that there is no such thing as an oak tree. In fact, there are many kinds of oaks and each oak has a specific niche and altitude. And if you get that part wrong, you actually create a lot of ecological disturbances, which can actually result in at least decline of species, including the decline of oaks.
Mm-hmm.
So, in this context, I'm kind of trying to understand what's happening with the oak ecology in the Himalayas.
So for a long time, several scientists have been pointing to the problem that oaks are facing in terms of germination and growing into adult trees. So we call the process regeneration in terms of, forest ecology. So it has been noticed for almost the last 30 to 40 years. And what we see, of course, you mentioned that there are many species that show occurrence at different altitudes. They kind of replace each other almost at different altitudes and different soil types. In the Western Himalayas specifically, we have about 6 species, and some of which are very common right now. But what we are seeing is a gradual change in these oak forests. And what are the kind of changes? One is that oaks themselves are not regenerating as well as they should be in many parts of their range. And that is because of climate change, because of lack of dispersers, over exploitation of the forest, fragmentation due to infrastructure. So oaks are facing a lot of problems, and everyone must have heard of the forest fires. Forest fires affect oaks very badly because these are large seeded species that require a lot of soil moisture to regenerate. So there are micro scale processes that are hindering the regeneration of oak, and that is translating into large scale shrinkage of the oak range in the Western Himalayas for most of the species. Some species are already occurring in very restricted ranges, so we should be very concerned about those as well. So, and the loss of oak at a landscape scale means that you're going to lose the entire suite of animal, plant, fungal, mushroom species that co-occur with oak, because oak is a very diverse and complex ecosystem. And what specifically in the Western Himalayas, we are seeing a replacement of oak by cheer pine, which is a much more hardy and something that can regenerate in almost any kind of soil and in open habitats.
So, would you have a link between the decline of oaks and the decline of species, including oaks themselves? Do you think we might be looking at a very slow but a definitive decline of certain oaks as well as species associated exclusively with them?
This is pretty much possible, but unfortunately, there's just not enough data to be able to say that for sure. But from whatever, from most of the scientists, you hear this, including my own observations, point to the fact that, for instance, if we take birds or frogs, there are certain forest specialists that can survive only in oak and near oak. Things like the brown wood owl, the rufous-bellied Niltava. There are many species that are really restricted to oak. And what in our work we found that these are being affected by fragmentation and by forest, degradation. But unfortunately, we don't have definitive data at large scales to be able to say this for sure.
But frogs and amphibians per se are amongst that group that is actually seeing large numbers of declines globally. What's happening in India, and what's your sense of what is happening?
So what we are finding with frogs, there are a lot of new species being found. Not a lot, but a few species are being found every year. And this is primarily because of the fact that, new areas are being explored. More and more researchers are going out to these areas, right? But what we are finding with frogs is that many of these frogs have extremely limited geographic range. Some of these frogs and toads are actually found in just a valley, say in the northeastern Himalayas, because they are very low. They have a very low capacity to disperse across habitats, right? Being amphibians. And so, if anything happens in even one valley within their range, they could be really at risk. And there are some species that are doing very well, like the plains toad is doing very well. In fact, you see it going higher and higher up in the Himalayas and possibly replacing the more specialized Himalayan toad. So those kind of competitive effects are also happening. The other major thing which is happening in the Himalayas and across India is that freshwater streams, which host a whole lot of species, are being affected by pollution. They're drying up because of climate change or, construction and infrastructure in the source areas of, the water sources. So there's several things coming together for amphibians. And because they don't have a good dispersal ability, they are likely to be far more at risk than even birds or other insects.
So that's really about one part of the country.
Yeah.
But because you also have an understanding of the Aravalis, I just want to move there and ask you, what kind of ecological risks are we seeing in this far drier ecosystem?
So, in fact, thorn scrub ecosystems and savannas that occur in the entire Aravallis, right from Delhi region all the way to southern Rajasthan and northern Gujarat, it's a very long range that has really been the epicenter of a lot of human settlements and so on. This area has very rare endemic species. It's got this thorn scrub forest that is considered to be one of the most endangered forest types in India, right? So, in the case of the Himalayas, in the case of the Aravallis, I'm sorry, it's a different set of factors. These are really affected by buildup of urban infrastructure, urban settlements, urbanization. For instance, the Aravallis in Haryana and Delhi are really threatened by large-scale urbanization, which is really at the doorstep of the Aravallis. And in the past, there were other threats like planting of Vilayati Kikar. At that point in time in the 70s, we didn't know any better. We seeded the Aravallis with Prosopis juliflora, which is the Vilayati Kikar. And that actually drove out a lot of native tree and other shrub species. So there are a number of problems. Currently, the biggest problem is climate change and urbanization.
So, coming back to Vilayati Kikar, there's a move to kind of uproot it, which is also a very difficult process because of the way that its roots are difficult to actually remove, as well as its propensity to regenerate quite easily, its hardiness really.
Yeah.
And how successful is that in kind of restoring the forest to its original self?
So, of course, there have been several projects, several areas where this has been attempted. And we've seen that it is successful only when it is immediately replanted with the original, the native species of the area. So, if you look at, for instance, Rao Jodha Park in Jodhpur, you find that because, it was Prosopis juliflora was very systematically uprooted, and the original dune vegetation was brought in, the desert rock vegetation was brought in. That was very successful indeed. However, it is a very expensive process. It is a very time consuming and laborious process, and it should definitely be something that governments should be supporting everywhere. But it is not easy.
I'll come to this larger question that I've been hoping to ask you, is that people seem to believe that a grassland, or for that matter even a wetland, isn't that ecologically worthy compared to a big, lush, thick green forest. And that's fundamentally quite erroneous, but also it tells us about how we think of ecosystems. Now, as somebody who teaches young people, I know you obviously teach people who are already very interested in the issue, but where do you think these kinds of fundamental lack of understanding about what is an ecosystem, about the environment, about things which are so fundamental and so commonsensical at some level, where do you think it's coming from, wearing your more educationist hat?
I think part of this is our colonial baggage. The open natural ecosystems, as they're called today, open natural ONEs, right? These include grasslands, fallows, open, marshes, and so on. These are extremely important. And I think part of the reason is that they were always considered to be wasteland and marked as such by the British. On the maps, they were marked as wastelands because in terms of, productivity and, commercial use, these lands were in fact quite low on the priority. But more recently, I think through the 80s and 90s, there was still very little work on grasslands and wetlands. Biologists were just beginning to understand these systems. Although in places like Gujarat, you had very eminent naturalists like Dharma Kumar Singh ji, who wrote a lot about the grassland fauna, but it didn't really get out to the policymakers. So I think what we do as educators is we expose students to the biodiversity and the threats across all of these different ecosystems. And as you said, wetlands in the Terai and marshes in, the Brahmaputra floodplains, or, even fallows, even agricultural fallows have been found to host over, in a more recent study, 350 species in a place like Uttar Pradesh. So this is all part of a continuum, and I think that more and more this is getting into the syllabi, and we are also researching these areas much more. There's been a lot more work on fauna of the grasslands, such as the wolves and the grey wolves and the black buck and so on. These are species that are being studied in more detail. So now I think we're going to see a difference in the way that we teach and the way we research, and hopefully the way it gets into the policy making for conservation.
What would you say if you looked at the global landscape? What are some examples that you think offer us not just hope, but also a very tangible way to realize those kinds of hopes?
So I think within India itself, we have a lot of examples. Across the world, I think there have been very successful examples of protected areas which have managed to bring back many species. Also, for instance, in Yellowstone National Park, the grey wolves have seen a resurgence. We've seen the Californian condor come back, peregrine falcons coming back. Within India, we're seeing vultures being bred in captivity and released into the wild, something that no one else had done before. So there are many examples, and I think that in India, it's really picking up. You have a huge network of people who are restoring grasslands, riverine vegetation, forests, and all kinds of ecosystems, and they're doing it in a very concerted and a science-based manner. So I think there are a lot of examples. What's missing, I think, is the ability to transcend these narrow geographic spaces and be able to replicate these over larger areas. Be able to do this in a way that that doesn't just focus on species but the entire ecosystem. So the whole ecosystem should be in the frame and not just those attractive species that we are working on. So for instance, in India, we have many species oriented programs, like for the Gangetic dolphin, for the cheetah, many other species, and it's good to have those, but then we often lose sight of their ecological connections across those areas. So in terms of, you asked, sorry for regressing, but you asked about positive examples. I think we can pick up many lessons from across the world. And I think one really good example is how, local communities, say in Mexico, are being involved in, restoring all of those varieties of crops and, the forests they used to coexist with in Central America. And I think it's only through such, community participation and large scale, conducive policy making that we can really do something about it.
That's quite important. And while we're talking about community participation, there's also been a lot of conversation around the pros and cons of ecotourism, because to some degree communities benefit, but then there's another aspect, which is that there's far more than the carrying capacity of the area, and so it's not very eco anymore. And what are your thoughts on that for conservation?
Absolutely. I think that first of all, the definition of ecotourism needs to be understood. True ecotourism means that you have a certain kind of social and ecological sustainability within the program, within the area. So you definitely need control on numbers, a ceiling on numbers of people who can go to these areas. As we all know, domestic tourism is seeing an explosion. People are wanting to go to all sorts of exciting, pristine areas for bird watching, for trekking, and so on. And these what this has done without any regulation, it can be quite harmful to the ecosystem. So we need some kind of policy making that would put a ceiling on numbers on any given day in certain localities, and much more of a controlled movement of tourists in these areas. And socially, what we are missing out on is being able to provide the local communities the wherewithal to take advantage of some of this tourism. Mostly it is city-based operators who are doing this and are who are making all the profits, and the local communities end up working as wage labor in these enterprises. What should be done, and I think many state governments are doing, is trying to create the village homestay concept where local communities can do the hosting of people. They can also work in the resorts, and they can be trained for guiding people into trekking and bird watching, for instance.
So, how does all of this help or enable conservation efforts, or at least stop species from decline?
So, unfortunately, I personally believe that we haven't, at least in India, we haven't been able to make that link very clearly because of the patchy kind of policy making that we've had. We've not been able to really connect up conservation with ecotourism for these very reasons. We've not been able to create those incentives for local people to protect. We've not been able to create an environment where all this is going to be done sustainably. So, and the average tourist who goes to, say, a place like Kanha National Park or Corbett Tiger Reserve is not really educated or made aware of the conservation issues, or really learn about conservation or contribute to conservation. So, in fact, I think a lot remains to be done in developing that connection.
So, who's done it well in the world, and what have they done? Or done it half well?
Yeah, as I said earlier, the protected area system has been very important in preserving many of the species, and it has been done well. But it's always a mixed bag. We've not been able to create the local awareness and local constituency for conservation as we should have had historically. So, in terms of ecotourism, we have better models that are happening in places like Venezuela and Peru, where local communities are really in charge of these ecotourism enterprises and are able to take advantage of it and also do it in a sustainable way. So Ecuador and Peru and all these places have much better run ecotourism enterprises. And I think community conservation really has picked up a lot in places like Indonesia, for instance. We've got local people running all these enterprises. They are protecting these areas. So it's happening. It's just very patchy.
I hear you. What strikes me is how many species seem to be leaving their original habitat, mainly because perhaps they're more in number, or their prey base is declining, or they're looking for new areas. And then they come into spaces where villagers are staying, and livestock is easy food. And we just saw pelting, for example, of the cheetahs and the cubs, which was a very somber moment and also a very sad moment. But this is a reality. And how do you think conservation can, we're seeing this everywhere. It's not just a one-time thing. We're seeing these kinds of conflict zones. So how do you make sense of that in the larger conservation landscape, or in the idea that in fact we can't let a species decline? On the other hand, these species are in fact not loved by local communities.
So, when we started out protecting the tigers and the lions and the cheetahs, we didn't realize that we would be so successful, because, India is fortunate enough to have that cultural, tolerance for species, and people, didn't really mind all these, even these large carnivores and elephants in their backyard, right? But the wildlife conservation has actually, there's been a byproduct of this, which is, really increasing human wildlife conflicts. And I don't think that as a country, we really have a plan as to how we're going to do this, how we're going to manage this, particularly because we don't believe in, lethal control. We don't believe in culling, which is which is correct and which is right.
So you don't believe in culling?
I think it's going to be a really tricky question in future if these kind of problems persist.
Like wildlife?
Or yeah, I mean, certain species definitely would be more. People would be more willing to and amenable to allow this kind of culling to happen. But we have to think of certain solutions. One solution that the governments generally take up is just capture of these problem carnivores in courts and taking them away to zoos. So that is one solution. However, I think it requires much more thinking. And we also have to think about defragmenting our ecosystem. So now we're thinking much more in terms of landscapes. If we have continuous landscapes of good quality habitat, human wildlife conflict is definitely going to go down. One of the reasons for increasing conflict, particularly in tiger areas, is the very extreme amount of fragmentation that has happened to our forests.
Which means that here's a forest and here's a forest, and in the middle there's nothing. So obviously there are people.
Yeah. So the chances, the human wildlife interface has to be minimized. You would always have, even after that, you'd have conflict, but then it would be much more manageable.
So are you seeing something happening in India already to make these corridors?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of emphasis now on corridors and connectivity and so on.
What are the other ways apart from these corridors? It's only corridors.
There's
right?
really no other way.
It's only corridors.
And even beyond that, once we have good landscapes, connected landscapes and so on, we still need a lot of professional biologists and forest officers who would have to look at this conflict in a much more effective way, because right now a lot of local communities are being affected and it's creating a lot of antagonism towards wildlife.
So that's kind of a kind of grim situation, and we read about it all the time. I mean, and there's obviously something about people that even in an urban city, if you see a leopard, your first instinct is to trap it in a room and kill it, beat it to death. So there's obviously a certain animosity rather than at least for urban dwellers versus forest dwellers, or peri-forest dwellers, so to say. But I want to end with a question which could be either your fantasy or your nightmare. Either ways, if you were made a CM of a state of your choice, with your whole life devoted to species and fighting extinction and looking at models of conservation through research, which is what you really specialize in, how would you use your knowledge? What would be the couple of things you do right away before they take away your powers?
So that really is a fantasy. But I think that what I would do right away is, first of all, make our protected areas far more effective by providing enough finances, providing enough training, connecting up these protected areas. The other thing that is extremely important is providing incentives for eco-friendly land users outside these protected areas and the areas that connect up, the human-dominated landscapes. So, for instance, can we make our agriculture more oriented towards, more organic farming? Could we do more of insect-friendly landscaping? In the cities, can we have more green areas? And all of this requires a huge amount of land use planning, which is currently missing. So, I would first of all make a land use plan for my entire state, where you would have these source areas for wildlife where the species are doing well, and you would identify the sink areas where species are not doing so well and try to connect these up in a much more efficient way for conservation. And also, I think I would provide much more resources than are currently available for wildlife, for research, for researchers to provide, to do research and to provide more data for guided research, for guided conservation, because right now we are quite constrained in the way we do research, because There are issues of permits, there's issue of funding. So I think much more science needs to go into our conservation. So I would actually put in a wildlife biology department and hire leading experts inside colleges and universities across the state so that there's more data generated, more people get aware of the issues and so on.
So I think it's a fantasy you seem to really relish. You've already got a plan, and the reason I really relish it along with you is because you not only have a tangible plan, but you offer a lot of hope. So with this, I really want to thank you for your time and for speaking with the Chintan Chats. But I also hope that you get to sit in that seat of power at some point really soon, before we know it, so that you can actually turn the needle with all the knowledge that you've accumulated in your career.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ghazala.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you.